Firstly, thank you for the invitation to be here, and particularly following two such amazing speakers. I'm standing here now as a privileged white Western male with a sense of shame, because it is privileged white Western males that have so comprehensively stuffed up the world. And it is that world that still privileges white Western males that has given so many people a real sense of despair as we look to the future. I know we just sang, we know there's always tomorrow, but the state of the world, the state of the environment is such today that for many people they're doubting whether there's always tomorrow. And they're doubting what I saw in the banner outside in the grounds of the university saying, "Your future knows no bounds." Well, for many people today, their futures do know very serious bounds. And it's with that sense of shame, as I said, that I come to this presentation, really arguing that it's time that privileged white Western male view of the world was set aside to allow other voices, other narratives, other wisdoms to take over. Doing this in the context of the Anthropocene, quickly about the Anthropocene, because I'm sure many people are well aware, the notion that the Holocene that lasted for the last 10 to 12,000 years was a very stable period. It allowed human settlement, it allowed this thing we called civilization to develop because the environment was so stable. But human activity has now had such an impact that we've entered a new geological period which has been called the Anthropocene, because human activity has actually affected the Earth physically in such a way that the certainties of the Holocene are gone. The climate's changing dramatically, other things are changing and changing very quickly, and it's because of human activity. Now, for some, the Anthropocene is a cause for celebration. This is yet another triumph of human achievement and ingenuity, the conquest of nature, and we hear this language of the concept quest of nature. We can manage the planet, we can do geoengineering. It's the great fulfilment of the human dream. Others, however, and I suspect just about everybody in this lecture theatre, will react with horror at what we have done and will seek somehow a less anthropocentric way, a less human-centred and human-privileged way to live in harmony with the rest of nature before it's too late. Now, there are critics of the idea of the Anthropocene saying that it's not just the result of human activity. Human activity has been around for a long time. It's the result of particular forms of human activity by dominant groups who've chosen to ignore the limits of the planet that we live on, and who do not understand the intrinsic value of the natural world, and particularly capitalism. And so there have been a number of writers who've suggested we should call it the Capitalocene, not the Anthropocene, because it is capitalism, pure and simple, that has led to the destruction of the world. The tradition of man having dominion over the rest of the world, able to exploit it for his profit, points to the importance of patriarchy and of monotheistic religions and the way that religions were set up, understanding that man was at the peak of creation and could dominate the rest of it for our own benefit. People have blamed Enlightenment humanism, the European Enlightenment, centring the human as the centre of everything and seeing the rest of the world as resources to be used up, spat out as necessary, that have been imposed on the world through colonisation. And the problem of human privilege, human exceptionalism. So there are people who are looking for the new paradigms, and don't have time to go into all this, but looking at the way that capitalism, endless growth, human hubris, an ideology of greed have got us where we are, and it's a dead end. What pretty well all the writers in this area agree on is that if there is a way forward, it will require strong communities, that communities are essential. And people like Naomi Klein talking about climate change, people like Raj Patel talking about economic crisis, many others all come back to the importance of grassroots communities, community action, community activism. As we look at our national leaders on climate change, we despair. But if we look at what's happening at community level, there are some amazing things that people are doing despite the inaction of their governments. And so this, to me, puts community development front and centre of where we move to the future. And it seems to me that community development has never been more important than it is now. But it does need to lose some of its anthropocentric functions, thinking about community as only consisting of humans and never mind everything else. And so we do, I think, have to rethink our ideas of community, development, participation, human rights and social justice. They've all been very anthropocentric, human-centred. And we have to understand humans as embedded in non-human communities. If it wasn't for non-human communities and our interdependence with other species, we would not survive 24 hours. And people talk about the bees and the vanishing bees and how we are dependent on those insects, thank you very much. And if we don't realise pretty quickly that we have a mutual interdependence with bees, we're in serious trouble. And we can see the beginnings of this reawakening, the interest in animal rights in many parts of the world, the rights of Mother Earth as articulated by Indigenous people, particularly in Latin America, and the Pachamama movements and so on, saying Mother Earth has rights that we have to respect. Nature is more than just recreation, but as being sustaining. Being in awe of nature rather than conquering nature. And when I look at Uluru in Australia, that great monolith, to Aboriginal people it's been sacred, it's been a centre of sacredness and spirituality. White men came along and immediately wanted to climb it, wanted to get on top of it, wanted to dominate it, wanted to say it's ours. It's a totally different way. When we look at the history of mountains, it's very interesting. Mountains tended to be held in awe and respect until the Europeans came along and saw them as something to be climbed. Everest, for example. It's the Europeans, the Westerners, who really wanted to get on top of things and dominate and show that we're better, we're on top, we conquer nature. What arrogance, what incredible arrogance. So the realisation of these things, I think, does give us some grounds for hope. I used to think that one of the differences between human rights and the rights of nature was that we can't expect nature to articulate rights and demand rights in the ways that humans can. Then I realised that if we only listen to Aboriginal people, to Indigenous people, they would tell us, yes, nature does demand its rights. It's just we've forgotten how to listen. And learning how to listen, again, to me is really important. And we have ecological community work, community development. It's about rivers and mountains and the earth and so on, and some really interesting and exciting things happening in many parts of the world that are saying we can't understand human community properly unless we really ground it in the natural world and become part of it. But, it's a big but, it's all very nice to talk about things like that, but I don't need to read out what's on the top paragraph there to make us all thoroughly depressed. Because green work can be seen as a bourgeois escape. Isn't it a lovely, nice middle-class thing to do, to get concerned about those things I was just talking about when we've got Trump and Erdogan and Brexit and Orbán and Duterte and all the rest of them? When we've got precarity, we've got We know all that stuff. So, despite what I was just saying, the need for immediate activism is as strong as ever, and maybe more so. Very much echoing what Bernadette was talking about before. And we forced ourselves into a position, as I was saying in the workshop yesterday, where progressives, including community workers, have become conservatives, because we're putting so much energy into trying to preserve what's left of what we value, the remains of the welfare state, some notion of rights, some notion of justice. We're fighting a defensive war. That turns us into conservatives. We've been trapped into not articulating the alternative vision. Because many of the issues that we fight about are really important, but they are also distractions. And we have to remember that the 0.1%, the masters of the universe and all the rest of us, they're really happy for us to be putting a lot of effort into things like marriage equality. Because, it's actually allowing them to get away with what they're continuing to get away with. Corporate greed, unchecked growth, environmental destruction can go unchallenged while we are put in a position of having to fight these important battles. I'm not saying they're not important, they are very important, but they can be a way that is used by corporate power to keep our eyes off the main game. It's a real challenge, I think, for community workers. We have to take both a long-term view as well as engaging with the immediate challenges. We have to develop and articulate alternative visions, not just react all the time to the latest lot of terrible things that are happening. We do have to react, but we have to do more. How do we develop an activism and a developmental approach that includes both? And I want very briefly to outline what I think are 5 important lines of development, if you like, for community development. First, stand against capitalism. At least in its current turbocharged, neoliberal, globalised form, it's destroying communities, destroying the commons, destroying the earth. We need to stand strongly against it and point out its utter destructiveness. And this means we have to assert the value of the commons and of public spaces and of public services, not just to protect what we've got, but as a vision of what we want, of where we want to be, of where we want to go. And it means alliances with the various groups that are opposing capitalism and its consequences. Labour, housing, poverty, and so on. Secondly, we have to, I think, strengthen our alliances with the environmental movement, partly because that's something that a lot of people are getting excited about and motivated about. Young people who are concerned about the future will mobilise around environmental issues. And the environmental and the social justice movements have to be together, because we are on about the same thing. My experience when I was involved in green politics in Australia was that many people in the environmental movement were looking to people like us for help with the social and economic justice and participatory democracy parts of their manifesto. I think people like communities workers have got really important roles to play in the environmental movement. As I said, community is so important in these transitions. Thirdly, I think we have to deconstruct human privilege. We've always had a strong social justice, human rights perspective. We know that we have to have it, because, as I've written in a couple of places, if we don't have that, the Hitler Youth was a wonderful community development project. You tick all the boxes, all the KPIs. Yeah, it involved young people, gave them a sense of belonging and engagement with their community. We have to have a social justice framework or human rights framework of some kind with what we're doing. And humanism has been at the centre of our social justice commitment. We're very good at deconstructing class privilege, male privilege, white privilege, heteronormative privilege, ableist privilege, and so on. We also have to take a bit of a look at human privilege and the way in which we have defined humans as so superior to the rest of the earth that we can treat the rest of the earth for our own needs. We like to kid ourselves that we're more intelligent than any other species. That's only because we define intelligence in human terms, so of course we are. But if we start to read some of the fascinating literature around biology, around plants, around animals, we realise how, on their own terms, they are very intelligent in their capacity to understand the environment, react to the environment, learn from the environment, interact with the environment. And then when you look at the things that humans do, like war and climate change and all the rest of it, we're not all that intelligent after all. Those sorts of ideas are really important for us in trying to de-centre human privilege a bit. We can't altogether because we are humans. We're always going to be thinking of the world in human terms, but we can at least ask some of those questions and try and think about what it means to be interdependent with the rest of the natural world rather than using it as resources. We know that relational reality is important, that it's out of relationships that we see reality emerging, not out of individual isolation. And that's really important. We depend on the non-human world. We're in community with it. I would die almost immediately if it wasn't for the millions of different microbes that are living inside my gut and on my skin. They're not me, they're separate organisms. They depend on me and I depend on them. And we depend on the world in many ways. Fourthly, we have to incorporate, validate Indigenous and non-Western worldviews, to pick up on what Francisco was talking about. The Anthropocene has to be seen as ecological colonialism, and we need to side with the post-colonial struggles that Francisco is talking about, but we need more than that. We need to resist epistemic colonialism. That is the colonisation of the mind, the colonisation of what knowledge means, of how we get knowledge, of how we understand the world. That we've done that in a very white Western way and we've devalidated Southern epistemologies. Indigenous people have far more ecocentric worldviews, seeing humans as part of nature, not separate from it. Realising that the land owns us, not we own the land. Owning land, what an arrogant thing to even think of. And yet, we take it so for granted. The natural world inherent in spirituality, rather than that Western notion of spirituality that makes it all very anthropocentric. Spirituality is about the individual and about people and what I feel, rather than about my connection to this amazing, wonderful natural world that we're part of but we're systematically destroying. More organic forms of decision-making and so on. And increasingly, commentators about the Anthropocene are seeing Indigenous wisdom, First Nations wisdom, as being essential if we're to have some sort of transition to a somewhat saner kind of world. So it's not just about siding with post-colonial struggles, it's about accepting epistemic colonialism and doing something about that. And the importance of cultural stories, art, music, dance and so on, I don't need to say that to a community development audience, we know that. The fifth one is the importance of what I've called matriarchal values. Because the Anthropocene has been patriarchal. Domination, control, management of nature. I hate the term environmental management. What an arrogant thing to say, environment, if we can manage the environment. So a transition to a more ecocentric society requires that we establish those matriarchal values as dominant, of caring, nurturing, sharing, cooperation, supporting community. These values that have been traditionally associated with women and women's ways of working and women's ways of knowing. And drawing very much on ecofeminist writers such as Mary Mellor, Val Plumwood, Carolyn Merchant, Donna Haraway, Those values are central to community development. It's what we live, it's what we work with, which is why so many of good community workers are women. And let's face it, it's women who do grassroots community particularly well. It's men like me that get all hung up in all kinds of ways about doing it. So this is not liberal feminism. This is not saying women should do lots of patriarchal things. I don't want to encourage women to join the army. I don't want to encourage anyone to join the army. Let's marginalise and exoticise the patriarchal and privilege the matriarchal. And to think about what that means. And I don't have time to go into what it means. It would be interesting to have a much longer discussion about that. And some final comments. Community development, both as practice and a way of thinking, I believe it will be central to a transition to a saner world. And if we don't have that strong community development base, then I think we really are all stuffed. But it's also, interestingly, a time when the physical sciences, the social sciences and the humanities are starting to come together. We see in the new biology, for example, a real interest in cooperation, symbiosis, interdependence, about how we stop studying organisms in splendid isolation, but actually understand that they get their being out of their relationship with other organisms. And the work of people like Lynn Margulies around evolution, those very different cooperative ways of evolution, fascinating stuff. And the ways in which the physical sciences, the social sciences and the humanities, instead of being apart from each other, now need each other. And I think community development needs all of those. We need some literacy in all of those. And finally, the writing about the post-human, which I don't have time to go into, but that suggests a major ontological shift, a major shift in what it means to be human, what it means to be. What does post-human community development look like? Community development that doesn't centre this sort of autonomous, isolated individual human as the centre of everything, but that rather suggests our very ways of understanding human and what it means, us being stretched, being changed, being challenged in both threatening and exciting ways. So I'll leave it at that, recognising that time's well and truly up, and thanks very much.